Hello, everybody. Apologies, just getting the presentations loaded. Once we've got that, we will start. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this late hour on the last but one day of the official COP27. Wonder whether it will be the last but one day or whether we're going to be running over into the weekend. But anyway, this COP began with a lot of hope when loss and damage was accepted as an agenda item on day one. This is the first time that loss and damage has been included as a standalone item on the agenda. However, we're now on day 11, and the agreement on loss and damage finance is still uncertain. So today, I think it's a good day to be talking about how we can unlock that progress. So welcome to our side event, Unlocking Progress on Loss and Damage. To many, the climate negotiations appear to be stuck. How do we unlock progress on loss and damage? So my name is Colin McQuiston, and I'm the Head of Climate and Resilience at Practical Action, and I'm the moderator for this session this evening. Practical Action is an international development organization. We work around the world in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, and we've been working on critical challenges for over 50 years. And what we've seen in the last few years is that many of those development achievements are being eroded. They're being eroded by climate change. So the climate emergency is ever present, and I'm hoping that the discussions that we have this evening will help us understand some of the possibilities to unlock that, that progress that is desperately needed. But that's enough from me. We've got a full panel of speakers. They're going to speak in order. We do have an additional panelist. He's currently in the G77 ministerial, trying to actually make progress on the COP27 decision text. I'm hoping he's going to join us. But to kick off our session, our first panelist is Cesar Rodriguez Gravito. So Cesar, do you want to speak from the dais? So Cesar is the Professor of Clinical Law and Faculty Director and Chair of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University School of Law. He is a human rights and environmental justice scholar and practitioner whose work focuses on global governance, climate change, socioeconomic rights, business and human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and the human rights movement. So Cesar, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen, and hello, everyone. So in the spirit that Colleen just described, I'm going to present the lessons from a study that we conducted in collaboration with a number of scholars and practitioners from around the world at NYU School of Law. The project that I lead is called the Climate Litigation Accelerator, which is a catalyst hub for collaboration and action on the climate emergency with the use of legal tools. The first project that we conducted was an overview of the universe of rights-based climate litigation around the world. That universe has only a few loss and damage cases, which is one of the gaps and the blind spots of that field of work. But before pointing to the blind spots and how the climate litigation community can help address those gaps, I'm going to first, and this is the first part of my brief presentation, I'm going to highlight the lessons from a much more well-established field of litigation, which is the one that addresses mitigation as opposed to loss and damage, right? As we know, there's a number of cases in our count, and we have a systematic database of all of the rights-based climate litigation. Over 200 cases have been filed since 2013, and I'm going to start using the presentation here so that we can. And this is taken, by the way, from this book which just came out literally this week, and it's open access, so you can see all the numbers and the figures and the analysis in that book, which is entitled Litigating the Climate Emergency, published by Cambridge University Press. And actually some of the authors of some of the chapters are sitting in this room. So what we found in that overview is that, as I said, there's an upward trend in the use of litigation to push forward and to increase the ambition on mitigation. I won't have time to go into the details of the data, happy to elaborate on the Q&A, but what I want to highlight here is the upward trend. For example, in 2021, there were twice as many cases filed before domestic, regional, and international courts and quasi-judicial bodies like the UN Human Rights Committee than in the previous year, 2020. So this is, and I would anticipate that this year the number is will be higher than in 2021. And we have updated numbers up to June of this year, and that trend is holding. Importantly here, one thing that I want to highlight is that despite the pessimism and the skepticism of some of the early critics of the use of litigation to advance climate mitigation, the outcomes so far have been pretty positive for plaintiffs. Of course, most of the cases are still pending because this is a young field. Most of the cases, most of the lawsuits have been filed since 2016, 2017. So they're ongoing, they're on appeal or have not been adjudicated yet at all. But among the rulings that have been, among the cases that have ended with a definitive ruling, as you can see here, the picture is pretty even between the breakdown between cases going for the plaintiffs and the cases going for the defendants, which in this field is mostly states, governments, as opposed to corporations, right? Roughly 15% of cases have been ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and 15% of cases for governments. I was a co-counsel in one of the first cases in this wave, representing 25 young people in Colombia who sued the Colombian government successfully for its lack of compliance with its own pledges on the reduction of deforestation. And back then, I remember speaking with even colleagues in the human rights field and encountering quite a bit of resistance. For example, to arguments about extending or expanding the rules of standing to have plaintiffs who were not necessarily based. Our case was against deforestation in the Amazon, so we filed the case on behalf of young people who were not based in the Amazon region, but we purposely chose plaintiffs who were based elsewhere in the country. And that we got away with that. The court accepted the fact that climate change is, of course, a global phenomenon, but definitely can allow for the expansion of rules of standing to include plaintiffs, in this case young people, who are being affected by climate change and who will be affected by climate change, even if they're not necessarily based in the place where the harm is being, the action that's leading to the harm, in this case deforestation, is happening. Of course, in this panel we'll have much more daring cases that are challenging targets, corporate targets that are based in one country for harms that are happening across the ocean, right? So that's that, and those rules have changed very quickly. So the first takeaway that I want to offer to you all is that the law in this field has changed very rapidly. And I would anticipate that it will change very rapidly in the field of loss and damage, as the evidence of losses and damages, everything from floods in Pakistan to droughts in Africa to extreme weather events, hurricanes in the Caribbean and so on, becomes more evident to judges as well. So I'm skeptical about skeptics because I've seen this happen already, and they were proven wrong, and I would anticipate that this would happen also in the field of climate, of losses and damage litigation. I'll skip this. These are images from well-known cases, and I'll devote the rest of my presentation to trying to extrapolate some of the lessons from that body of jurisprudence and litigation to think in a more forward-looking way to future litigation on losses and damage, So the first lesson, I'll go very quickly here in the interest of time, is that, of course, one of the positive impacts of cases like Urgenda or Neubayer or the recent Amazon Fund case in Brazil is that those lawsuits and those rulings have served effectively to domesticate international pledges and international legal standards and international scientific consensus around the need to speed up and scale up action against climate change, specifically climate change mitigation. Second, more socio-legal impact, which is equally important to my mind, is that litigation has really helped crystallize a community of lawyers and activists who have rallied behind specific cases. And one of the encouraging things about the climate litigation space is that it's not fully dominated by lawyers, but actually lawyers work quite in close collaboration with scientists and activists. And some of the plaintiffs in these cases are actually social movement organizations, like everything from the indigenous movement in Brazil to the Friends of the Earth of the world. Finally, I'll skip a couple of these. I already mentioned this. Of course, one of the key goals and outcomes of this litigation, line of litigation, is to increase speed and ambition. And this, I think, of course, the climate crisis won't be solved one case at a time, but it has effectively meant accelerating the pace of change and the ambition in climate targets in many countries, and not just in Europe. As I mentioned earlier, for example, the Bolsonaro government in Brazil got quite a bit of heat for its disastrous climate record, and it was through courts that that record became even more evident, and there was pressure for the government to do more about the Amazon. What does this tell us? What does all of this tell us about the potential for litigating loss and damage? First, and this is pretty obvious, and it's already happening with some of the pioneer cases that will be presented here, is that litigation helps set the agenda. So of course, it's crucial to set the agenda in meetings like this one, but we also know that implementation and even the agreements fall way short of what is needed to address loss and damage at scale. So setting the agenda is a crucial first outcome of future loss and damage litigation and even of existing cases. Again, speed and ambition, just like in the existing litigation, would be increased through strategically framed litigation on loss and damage. A third component which I want to highlight, I want to stay with this point for a moment, because one of the blind spots of the existing body of litigation is that 90% of rights-based litigation lawsuits have been targeted governments as opposed to corporations. And now that we have data on, and even satellite data on emissions from specific projects, steel plants, coal-fired plants, and so on and so forth, the responsibility of corporate emitters becomes even more visible, even visually evident. And so one thing that cases like RWE and Holcim are doing that are going to be presented here is to put the pressure on corporate targets in ways that the existing body of litigation has not quite managed to do. And of course, I already mentioned this in the comparison, is we need to clarify and develop key legal standards when it comes to loss and damage. That's been done incrementally in the field of mitigation, for example, through the development of doctrines like the fair share contribution of countries to climate mitigation. Most of the conceptual and practical work in terms of giving content to legal standards when it comes to loss and damage is yet to be done by courts explicitly, and this can only be done through creative lawyering and litigation. Finally, I'm going to skip the risk of, but I don't want to offer too rosy a picture of the virtues of litigation without noticing, at least in passing, that there are risks, right? Risks to using litigation. One of them is that there might be a zero-sum framing between negotiation and litigation. And certainly, in the mitigation space, those two communities, negotiators and litigants, have basically worked parallel to each other, if not in kind of in a relationship of mutual distrust or at least distance, in ways that I think are unnecessary and that can be addressed more wisely in the space of loss and damage. Let me jump to my last slide and offer a few pointers on how to address those risks and take advantage of the potential of litigation to advance loss and damage claims in practice. These are some of the key questions. So it'll be extremely important to be careful about choosing jurisdictions and choosing defendants. This, of course, applies across the board to all kinds of litigation, but because this might potentially involve extraterritorial claims, meaning, for example, in RWE case, the responsibility of a Germany-based energy company for harms being produced in Peru, then choosing the right jurisdiction and venues is crucial. I oftentimes, because my program is based in New York, but we work globally, we are oftentimes asked whether we would like to pursue litigation in the US against US-based companies. So from the point of view of the responsibility of those companies, the answer, of course, would be yes. But a political economy of the reality of courts in the US would point in the direction of that maybe this is not the perfect time to do that, given what courts are these days, and not just the Supreme Court in the US. One of the crucial discussions that we're already having with colleagues here and outside of this room is remedies. What type of remedies should be pursued? Right? In this COP, we've seen, luckily, already discussion about financial versus non-financial remedies, but the scale, the nature is yet to be determined. Importantly, I already alluded to this. I think there's already a more constructive incipient conversation emerging between negotiators and litigators. We ourselves, with colleagues in Bangladesh, are starting to put together a collaborative network of people who come from those two worlds to see how each of those communities can be mindful of the progress being made in the other world, so as to hopefully create more of a virtuous circle between negotiations and litigators. Finally, I think that the basic lesson or the basic conclusion from litigation carries over to existing and future loss and damage litigation, which is that litigation can serve and has served as a nudge for negotiators. And it sets the limits, it increases the ambition, and it keeps the pressure on governments, but I would hope also on corporations in this emerging issue of loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar, for helping us understand the legal context for litigation and how we can use it to push forward ambition on climate action. Now we're going to shift gears. We'll move from the litigation side to the plaintiff side. So I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Saul Luciano Ulloa from Peru. Saul is a farmer and mountain guide from Juarez in the Peruvian Andes. And Saul is a representative of the people who are impacted by climate change directly, and the people who are often not given a voice in these fora, these negotiations. So Saul has a unique story, and he's going to share his experiences in a legal case that he will provide more details of. So, Saul, if you'd like to start your presentation. Thank you.
Hola, buenas noches con todos los presentes. Soy Saúl Luciano, soy de Perú, de un departamento de Ancash y de la ciudad de Huaraz.
Good evening, I'm Saúl Luciano Ulloa. I'm coming from Peru, from the region of Ancash, Huaraz.
Bueno, como podrán ver en la fotografía, bueno, es la montaña, la Cordillera Blanca.
As you can see in the photography, there is the mountains in the Cordillera Blanca in Perú.
Alrededor de esa montaña, bueno, como en todos lados, ¿no? Hay comunidades, hay ciudades.
Around these mountains, there are no communities, no cities.
Yo vivo en el valle abajo de estas montañas y bueno, hay otras ciudades también, centros poblados, pequeñas estancias que vivimos alrededor de estas montañas.
I live in the downside of the mountains, and there are little communities around and little towns.
Bueno, y soy también hijo de pequeños agricultores. Yo también cultivo la tierra y bueno, como todo, ¿no? Como todo niño hemos crecido cerca de las montañas y de profesión me he formado como guía de alta montaña.
I'm a farmer. I come from a family that work on the land, and I'm a mountain guide.
Durante el proceso donde yo estaba, pues sigo viviendo, he visto y sigo viendo cómo la desglaciación, cómo la montaña, el glaciar está desapareciendo. La laguna que podemos ver es laguna glaciar, o sea, hablamos de que esta laguna antes era glaciar.
In my daily life, I can see how the glacier is melting, and the lagoon that you are seeing there, the lake, is called Palcacocha Lake.
Su nombre de la laguna es Laguna Palcacocha, y bueno, las montañas que podemos ver alrededor tienen nombre.
Around the Palcacocha Lake, there are mountains that has their own names.
La laguna que está, bueno, con roca se llama Pucarrangra, y la montaña que está con más glaciar se llama Palcarraju, que está a 6.150 metros sobre el nivel del mar.
Excuse me. I didn't get one of the mountains that has some rocks is called Pucarrangra, and the other one Palcarraju. And it's in 6,150.
Bueno, desde mi casa hay otras montañas pequeñas, y igual hay una desglaciación. Bueno, les voy a contar como agricultor, el cambio climático es real, lo que está pasando, y bueno, nosotros estamos sufriendo por estos cambios.
We are suffering the changes of climate change.
Por ejemplo, las cosechas ya no son como antes. Yo recuerdo cuando era niño, eran abundantes. Igual mis padres cuentan que eran mucho mejor porque las lluvias eran permanentes.
What we got from the land, it's not the same than when I was a child, and in comparison with the stories that my family told me about.
Bueno, ahora como la lluvia ya no es permanente, los pastos están secando, y también los animales que viven cerca de las montañas y también los animales que tenemos, vacas, ovejas, también están sufriendo por falta de pasto.
And there is a scarcity of water, and we suffer drought, and the animals also suffer in our lands.
Bueno, continuando, ¿no? Ya a la edad de 20 años, bueno, yo me presenté a la escuela de guías, donde a partir de ahí he tenido más contacto con el glaciar por el trabajo, y veo pues, ¿no?, cada año cómo el glaciar está retrocediendo.
Since I am a mountain guide, I studied for that when I was 20 years old, and I see how the glacier is retreating.
Y bueno, igual allá cuentan los guías antiguos, los porteadores, que de aquellos años cuentan cómo era el glaciar, y pues se sienten igual como todos, ¿no?, tristes porque el glaciar está desapareciendo.
And the muleteers and carriers are also sad because we can see how the glacier is retreating.
Sí, por haber visto, ¿no?, como todos las personas de día a día están preocupados por la desglaciación, por la por las lluvias, igual como yo, y también pues he decidido con la ayuda de Germanwatch, hemos presentado una demanda ante la corte alemana.
Therefore, I started to sue to RWE in the German court.
Bueno, la demanda es contra una empresa RWE que es la más contaminante de Europa.
Against RWE, which is the most polluting company in Europe.
Nosotros estamos pidiendo que la empresa se haga responsable por los daños y pérdidas que han ocasionado, que han contaminado, y la empresa tiene que poner su parte.
We request that RWE is responsible for a percentage of all the responsibility of the melting of the glaciers.
El gobierno local está promoviendo un proyecto definitivo para la seguridad de esta laguna, y la empresa tiene que contribuir.
The local government in Seoul's region is going to start infrastructure, to build an infrastructure to prevent, and this is the responsibility of RWE to pay for this.
La laguna que vemos ya ocasionó daños, ya ocasionó desastre, bueno, producido por el cambio climático.
Because of the climate change, this lake already suffered a disaster in 1941.
En el año 41 ocurrió una avalancha desde la parte alta que vemos, desde los 6.000 metros sobre el nivel del mar, cayó a la laguna que está a 4.500 metros de altura y provocó una avalancha, y pues rompió el dique que podemos ver que está adelante, al lado. Esto pues bajó quebrada abajo, destruyendo una parte de la ciudad.
And this catastrophe, we suffered in this area, and the dam got broken, so we suffer. The people from Gora suffered this.
Destruyó todo a su camino, y murieron también 1.800, otros cálculos dicen 2.000 personas.
2,000 people died.
Bueno, sobre daños y pérdidas, pues desde los años 35, más o menos desde el año 40, los glaciares han empezado a derretirse y han empezado pues a aumentar su volumen, y consecuencia tenemos muchos aluviones que han sucedido.
Oh, okay. Because of the melting of the glaciers, the lakes got bigger, and then there were a flood.
Desde los años 40 ha habido los primeros aluviones.
Since 1940, there were the first floods.
Y bueno, desde ahí, bueno, el gobierno ha trabajado construyendo diques, construyendo defensas para proteger las ciudades que habían más abajo.
Since then, the government started building dams to protect the cities.
Y bueno, desde ahí, bueno, el Perú y bueno, las ciudades ahí alrededor han empezado ya pagando o han empezado a sufrir las consecuencias del cambio climático.
And since then, the cities and the towns started to suffer the consequences of climate change.
Perú, bueno, todos sabemos que todos contaminamos. Perú es un país pues que poco ha contribuido y pues es el país también que ha estado pagando ya las consecuencias.
Every one of us pollute, and we are all suffering the consequences in Peru. And we are not a big contributors to the climate change.
Sí, y bueno, los daños y pérdidas continúa ahora, el glaciar sigue desapareciendo, son daños o pérdidas irreversibles y en general pues es lo que estamos sufriendo son pues más pérdidas.
And loss and damages continue to happen, and we are suffering all this.
Sí, bueno, quizás acá nos hemos reunido con un congresista, con nuestra autoridad de Perú que está presente, quizás nos podría dar alcances más técnicos.
We have met a congressman here and authorities from Peru. We have met here at the COP, and maybe they can give us some advice in like technical advices.
Sí, muchas gracias. Quizás el colega Noah nos podría dar más detalles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saul and Andrea, for sharing the context for someone living in increased risk due to climate change. We're now going to hand over to Noah Walker. Noah is a research fellow at University College London and a legal advisor at Germanwatch. His experiences as a legal anthropologist researching climate justice and supporting litigation. So, Noah, if you'd like to provide us with some more details about the RWE case and your work, please proceed.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Saul, for sharing your experience with us. Saul's case starts from a very simple premise, namely that in times of climate change, we're all neighbors. What that means is that a company like RWE over in Germany has the capacity to affect Saul's life in Peru through what they're contributing to climate change. And of course that counts for RWE just as it does for all of the other big polluters. And so in legal terms, this case is quite simple. It's basically applying neighborhood law, the kind of law that's usually used to resolve conflicts between neighbors. It has to do with property interference. So, you know, imagine your neighbor has a wall on their property. The wall is old and crumbling, and you're afraid it's going to fall over and damage your house or fall on top of you. So you sue your neighbor and get a court order for them to fix the wall. Just in this case, the two neighbors happen to be on different continents. But of course, in times of climate change, the neighborhood is expanding. And so here, Saul is asking for RWE to contribute financially to flood risk reduction measures in the Peruvian Andes, addressing risks caused by glacial retreat, by climate change. And this case was filed just around 7 years ago, so it's been going on for a long time. It was initially dismissed by a lower court, but then on appeal, it was found to be admissible. So the judges actually said that the case is solid in legal terms. At the German court, the judges said they think, in principle, it's possible to hold major emitters responsible for their contribution to these kinds of climate change impacts we can see all around the world. And now the case is in the evidentiary phase, so the judges are looking at whether in this specific instance there's enough evidence, and the case is still ongoing. In fact, just a few months ago, in May of this year, judges traveled up to Lake Palcacocha in Peru. They were right up here by this glacier to go look at the situation, and they came with a team of scientific experts who were looking at how the glaciers have retreated and how this has led to a potential serious risk affecting Saúl, and not just Saúl, but around 50,000 people who live below this lake in the danger zone. And of course, the evidence on all of this is getting clearer and clearer. Every few years, the new IPCC reports come out, and they show us that the science is getting ever clearer in terms of that we can see all of these impacts around the world and link them very clearly to climate change. And so, for instance, for this specific glacier above this lake, there was an attribution study done that found that around 95% of this glacier's retreat is caused by anthropogenic climate change. So that's a very, very clear link. And so what this case has the potential to be is a massive precedent for holding major emitters responsible, and not just RWE, but all of the other big emitters in other parts of the world that have caused this problem for people in Peru and in so many other countries that are where people are vulnerable, are facing these impacts, and have limited means to address them, despite the fact that, like Saúl was saying, people in Peru have contributed so little. And why are we talking about this case here in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 in the final days of the negotiations? And of course, this is a COP where loss and damage is a very hot topic. And the simple truth is that it shouldn't be necessary for Saúl to bring this case. Really, this should have been resolved years ago at a political level. But the fact is that the biggest polluters, the wealthiest countries that are most responsible for climate change and for these impacts in places like Peru, they're unwilling to take responsibility. They're unwilling to help pay for addressing these losses and damages that we can see around the world in places like Peru, suffering from melting glaciers, but also for so many small island nations threatened by sea level rise and all the other impacted people in the world. So really, if there's no political solution, then the only option that people like Saúl, people who are affected by loss and damage, the only option they have to defend themselves is by taking these major emitters to court. But really, this is sending a message to policymakers that they need to find a sustainable solution to all of this, because it shouldn't be necessary for every farmer in the world to bring a major emitter to court. So what we really need is to find long-term political solutions, to find mechanisms for people like Saúl, for Peruvians to get support for addressing these impacts. And we need those who are most responsible to accept the responsibility. And if they're not going to do that at a political level, then people like Saúl will force major emitters to take responsibility through the courts. So really, it's in the interests of these companies to push for a political solution because otherwise they're going to face more and more of these cases, and maybe not even just companies. Maybe we'll still start seeing cases like this against entire governments. And so maybe coming back to the beginning, this case shows that in times of climate change, we're all neighbors. And what Saúl is asking RWE, the defendant, is to be a good neighbor and to accept their responsibility and to help Saúl deal with these impacts. But of course, it's not just companies that are responsible, but the states that are here in the COP negotiating, they should also be good neighbors and help those who are facing loss and damage around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. That was very well located speech, putting the case of Saúl into what is happening here at COP27. But also you highlighted the importance of science. So it's very good that I'm now pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Delta Myrna. Delta is the lead for the Science Hub for Climate Litigation at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Her role provides timely scientific evidence to support legal cases that hold fossil fuel companies accountable for climate-related damages. Dr. Myrna reviews legal communications for scientific accuracy, connects legal teams with technical experts, and leads trainings for scientists working at the intersection of climate science and law. So, Delta, over to you to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So as you know, we're here today to talk about loss and damage, and I want to go into a little bit more detail on the type of science that Noah was just talking about. So there are important scientific advancements that may help to move the needle on loss and damage. Specifically today, I want to talk about advances in attribution science and in obstruction research, which I think both of these kind of coming together can play a role to help address responsibility for climate impacts from polluting nations and companies, making the argument for climate loss and damage harder to ignore. So I want to start with a breakdown of attribution science. So attribution is science that helps to answer the question, did climate change play a role in that? Over the past decade, attribution science has developed to the point where scientists are able to identify and quantify the role that climate change plays in major climate impact, and can look to see the source of carbon emissions, ultimately connecting climate impacts to source. This graph here looks at various climate impacts and the strength of evidence that connects these impacts to science today. So you can see that not all impacts are understood equally, but it's important to note that the science really is advancing. This is a very young field. It's about 10 years old, and there's been a lot of progress that has been happening in that short period of time. Now science is shifting to be able to not just look at climate, science is able to attribute changes to specific emission sources. So here I'm showing you a graph of the global carbon emissions from all fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers in the blue. So this is since 1850 in millions of tons. In the red is just the top 90 carbon producers. So this work shows that nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions, starting from the Industrial Revolution onward, can be traced to just 90 carbon producers. With this, we were able to look at how these emissions relate to specific climate impacts. And what did we find? So UCS research, the place where I work, shows that emissions from the extraction of and production of these products from these 90 major fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers in this time period contributed to around 42 to 50% of all global temperature rise. We also see that around 26 to 30% of all global sea level rise, again, comes from the products of just these 90 companies. And we also see that the majority of ocean acidification globally is tied to these same emitters. These numbers can be broken down to the level of individual companies. So shown here are the top 20 investor-owned and major state-owned companies related to increases in ocean acidification over the period 1965 to 2015. So this is a really important methodology that scientists are now looking to extend to better understand impacts and attribution more locally. I'm going to shift a little bit here and show an example of advances in attribution science that focus on specific events. So in May of last year, a study was published that looked at economic damages related to human-caused sea level rise from Hurricane Sandy, which was a storm that hit the east coast of the US. Some important findings. So by isolating sea level rise and just the sea level rise that was caused by climate change, they found that approximately $8.1 billion US dollars of Sandy's damages are attributable to climate change, again, just from the human-caused part of sea level rise, climate change-caused part. Because of climate-related sea level rise, the flooded area affected an additional 71,000 people. So they are down to kind of the block size of being able to see how these emissions are impacting events. This is a really key methodology, and the same general approach demonstrated here may be applied to impact assessments for other past and future coastal storms. But it's important to know that physical emissions are just one piece of the puzzle. To understand the current state, we also need to understand corporate obstruction. So for nearly 7 decades, many of the world's largest fossil fuel companies have knowingly worked to conceal information or deceive the public about the realities and risks of climate change. Recent studies have documented that fossil fuel industry was broadly aware of the climate risk of their products since at least the 1960s. As early as 1977, representatives from major fossil fuel companies attended dozens of congressional hearings in the US in which the contribution of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas was discussed at this governmental level. In the 80s, the American Petroleum Institute, which is a major fossil fuel lobbying group, was intentionally spreading false and misleading information about climate change. And by the 80s, at least one company was already considering climate implications of large-scale fossil fuel extraction projects for their own infrastructure. So they already understood the impacts of climate change, and they were making adjustments to their plans and infrastructure to address that back in the 80s. Fossil fuel companies chose to downplay and distort the evidence of climate change, engaging in decades-long campaign against climate action. Where would we be today if fossil fuel industry acted in the 1960s when they were beginning to understand the grave impacts that their products would have? I think this is a really important question for us to be asking in some of these legal cases as well. The science is damning, but the information we have is only as useful as our ability to communicate it. So I wanted to talk about a couple of lessons that we've learned communicating the science. So we've learned that you can't get a new future unless people can see themselves in that future. We need language. We need to use language that speaks to experience, not just numbers. We need to communicate pathways forward as well as shortcomings and dangers. We can't just dose people with what is wrong. There needs to be real next steps. Finally, different audiences respond to different things. You can be honest and consistent with your message while providing relevant examples to specific audiences. When communicating around climate science in today's world, it's essential to understand the role that disinformation can play in communication. Disinformation around climate change is rampant. When dealing with disinformation, it's really important that we don't repeat the lies, but we counter them. All right, I'm going to say a statement, and this is kind of an old study that's been done. So I'm going to say a statement, and I want you to remember the first thing that you think about while I'm talking. Okay, ready? Don't think of an elephant. All right, how many of you are thinking of an elephant right now? That's the classic line, right? So if you just put don't in front of something, you really continue to carry those narratives along. So as we're thinking about this space, as we're communicating these ideas, it's really essential that we're being very smart about how we're communicating them. But even more so, communication is only as useful as the action that it inspires. How do we persuade polluters to pay for the losses and damages that they've caused? We're waiting to see if tomorrow will provide any answers to that. But there are pressure mechanisms for inaction towards responsibility. And as Noah laid out so well, litigation really is one of those pathways. So thank you.
Thank you, Delta. Now we're going to shift gears because I will be introducing Hafiz Khan. Hafiz is a climate negotiator for Bangladesh and supports the least developed countries in the negotiations. And I think we're very lucky to have him here because I understood he was in a meeting with the G77 group just a few moments ago. Hafiz is an environmental lawyer working to promote climate justice. He is leading the Center for Climate Justice Bangladesh as Executive Director. He is a member of the Loss and Damage team of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and he has been working for at least 13 years on legal and policy issues related to the environment, natural resources, and climate change. So, Hafiz, I pass it over to
you. Thank you, Colin. I'm very honored and privileged to speak in this event. Colleagues and friends, let me start with saying that our understanding is that mitigation is the best form of averting the loss and damage. and adaptation, then again that can reduce the potential risk of the loss and damage. But finally, we need to deal with the residual risk. Then how the words addressing is taking place. And with that understanding, back in 2013, we agreed to establish Warsaw International Mechanism to address the loss and damage. But interestingly, in 2015, the Paris Agreement adopted and incorporated a standalone article, Article 8. The words, if we look at the Article 8, that Article 8 intends to avert, minimize, and address. Now, question is, we got a new standalone article on loss and damage, but with an exclusion clause, para 51, 1CP21, decision 1CP21, that states that that article does not provide any basis for liability and compensation. Actually, in Paris, I do recall, we all negotiators from the developing country, we were almost crying. We could not accept this exclusion clause. The trade-off was that to get a standalone article. We got it. We wanted to go beyond adaptation. Now here at COP27, we started negotiation day before the COP started on 5th November, Saturday night. We spent here until 4 a.m. We were fighting on the agenda item. So developed country parties, they wanted to see clearly a footnote with this agenda item that would say this agenda item does not provide again basis for liability and compensation. But we, all the negotiators from developing country, we did not agree it. The final compromise was that there will be a read out by the COP presidency that this agenda item does not involve liability and compensation. Now, I do see most of we are here, the lawyers. May I ask you, what does it mean? What is the real legal implication for this COP presidency read out? Then, end of the second week, when we started actually this discussing on funding arrangement for loss and damage, we do see the co-facilitator prepared a kind of not elementary paper, but some notes with a clear footnote. Then again, these as outcomes of the agenda item does not involve any liability and compensation. We did not accept it. But colleagues, actually, we developing country parties are not asking for liability and compensation. To some extent, liability, I mean, compensation in terms of monetary compensation would not be sometimes useful. But we would not like to exclude these liability and compensation issues. That's why I do appreciate the legal communities all over the world. They are trying to explore the different jurisdictions to file cases, including myself. I'm very happy to share with you that we are trying to identify a climate victim from Bangladesh. I do recall that German Watch Christopher is here. He was my boss in German Watch back in 2012 when Rhoda was exploring a victim to bring in German court. We tried to identify a victim also from Bangladesh. Christopher is noting. So finally, we scientists and other lawyers, Rhoda decided to go Peru because glacier melting was better case, data was there. The Peruvian farmer finally filed a case in Germany. That case is still pending, but we would like to take this model. We would like to identify a farmer from Bangladesh, and we would like to file a case in different jurisdiction, not a single jurisdiction. Maybe we'll start filing a petition before our Human Rights Commission, like Filipino president. to start the legal campaign from the Bangladesh. That can be a bottom-up approach. So the colleagues who you are in the room, if you are interested, we would be happy to hear your ideas. We would be happy to accept your support to take this initiative. Then again, Colin is asking me to stop, just saying that our demand, we need to establish this financial facility or response fund here at COP27. Then next 2 years, a transitional committee can work further to develop the operational modalities. And we would like to adopt that operational modality at COP29. So mandates for 2 years to a transitional committee that can be resulted at COP29, a package of operational modalities. We are not asking too much. Our vulnerable communities, our ecosystems need immediate response. That's why we need to act immediately. Developed country parties need to respond to our need. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Hafish. And now I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Leen Van Dam. Leen is a senior campaigner for the Center for International Environmental Law's Climate and Energy Program. She is specialized in advocacy for equitable climate policies and global climate justice. Leen contributes to work on human rights and climate change. She co-facilitates the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, convening civil society organizations advocating for the promotion and respect of human rights in climate action, and focuses on the UN climate change regime and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So Leen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very interesting panel. So I will be speaking about human rights and how the human rights framework and human rights obligations can push progress on loss and damage within the UNFCCC and beyond. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. The devastating impacts that we are already seeing across the world are leading to the destruction of ecosystems and to human rights harms. An example of that are the devastating floods in Pakistan that affected the right to life, the right to adequate housing, the right to food, the right to education, and the right to health. So what the human rights community evaluates as harms to human rights is what is being called loss and damage in the international climate negotiations. But ensuring effective remedy for these harms has long been neglected and is still being neglected in these international climate negotiations. International cooperation and accountability are essential ingredients for ensuring that all people harmed by the climate crisis have access to effective remedy. Other key human rights principles to realize this are access to information, public participation, substantive equality, and preventing and redressing discrimination. The human rights system and countries' human rights obligations are an important avenue to find solutions for people experiencing loss and damage, to ensure their right to remedy, and also to push progress under the UN Climate Convention to deliver action on loss and damage that is rights-based and therefore for those who are facing the highest impacts of the climate crisis. An important step was taken last year by the Human Rights Council with the establishment of a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. The special rapporteur made loss and damage a priority, and his first thematic report that was recently published and presented at the UNGA was about public participation and mitigation, but also with a focus on loss and damage. In that report, he states that the major emitting countries have abandoned their duty to cooperate in line with the principles of international cooperation. Other international human rights bodies and national courts also have confirmed the obligations of states to protect affected individuals and communities from climate-induced harm, domestically and extraterritorially. In some cases, there have even been direct references to loss and damage by these human rights bodies, such as in a joint statement by 5 human rights bodies, treaty bodies, declaring that states must cooperate in good faith in the establishment of global responses addressing loss and damage suffered by vulnerable countries. Further clarifying states' human rights obligations in the context of climate change is important to enable ambition. National, regional, and international human rights institutions are taking important steps, as demonstrated by the Philippine Commission inquiry on climate change, the recent decision by the Human Rights Committee on the case on Torres Strait Islanders, and a general comment that is currently being developed by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, with a specific focus on climate change. In this regard, the initiative by Pacific Youth that is now being taken forward by Vanuatu to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on human rights and climate change will be an important pathway to do so. This initiative is currently being taken forward. A resolution will be tabled at the UN General Assembly in the coming days or weeks. And although we only need a simple majority to send this resolution or this question to the ICJ, it is very important that as many countries as possible will show their support for this resolution to give a very clear and strong mandate to the ICJ. So what does all of this mean for COP27? In Sharm el-Sheikh, parties must translate human rights principles into concrete rights-based solutions to address loss and damage across multiple technical tracks. Remedying loss and damage requires much more than just money, but adequate financial resources are essential. The costs of disasters and the impacts of slow onset events is putting immense pressure on national budgets, mainly for countries in the Global South, which is hampering the progressive fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights. Therefore, we need, as Hafiz already mentioned, the urgent creation of a loss and damage finance facility that can ensure the delivery of new and additional finance for loss and damage that is needs-based, rights-based, public and grant-based, and also gender-responsive. It is very important to also learn from the mistakes that have been made with climate finance for mitigation and adaptation, and to make sure that loss and damage finance is better suitable to address the needs of those most vulnerable. Wealthy countries have built their economy through the exploitation of other countries' natural resources and people, and of fossil fuels, and so they must take the responsibility and stop delaying action. The solutions are on the table, and the money is available. Billions are going into subsidies for fossil fuels and into the military. Delivering action and support for loss and damage is therefore a political choice, and further delaying the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility is a breach of countries' human rights obligations. In addition to this, COP27 must also make progress towards a rights-compliant implementation and operationalization of the Warsaw International Mechanism that was also mentioned by Hafiz. And an important element of this mechanism is the Santiago network that was established in Madrid at COP25, and that is actually operationalized here at COP27. It's a network that aims to provide technical assistance to developing countries, which is also very important to ensure that the needs of those most vulnerable are being addressed in an adequate way. So here at COP27, with a big civil society coalition, we have been advocating for a network that would have the institutional arrangements in place that would be guided by principles rooted in human rights, which includes meaningful participation of those of the front lines of climate impacts, demand-driven, locally led and gender-responsive solutions, guidance by the best available science, including indigenous and local knowledge, direct access for those most marginalized, and transparency and accountability. Yesterday, those negotiations ended, and although we didn't get what we want, which is always the case in this process, we did get a reference in the decision on the Santiago network that refers to the important preamble paragraph of the Paris Agreement that reminds states of their human rights obligations in the context of climate action. Next to that, there was also the decision to establish an advisory board of the Santiago network, which includes representatives of indigenous peoples, of women and girls, and of youth and children. This is very important because public participation is a right, and it's especially important for those who are most vulnerable to ensure that the solutions that are being developed are actually the right solutions. So in conclusion, as climate impacts are escalating, the confirmation that Paris made in the preamble that I just referred to is more relevant than ever. And the failure of countries, especially those bearing historic responsibility, and with the most available resources, to phase out fossil fuels and to reduce emissions, to provide adequate support for adaptation and to meaningfully address loss and damage is causing immense human suffering and is not compliant with international human rights obligations. This is leading to a surge in climate-related litigation, as we've heard today, and it is therefore in the interest of all states to come up with real and rights-based solutions for those at the front lines of the climate crisis here at COP27. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So we've heard from the panel, and now it's your chance. So if you've got a question, you'd like to put your hand up, we can take 2 or 3 from the audience and then we'll answer them. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ed Malaga. I'm that member of parliament that Saul mentioned from Peru, so I want to answer directly to him. I want to start by saying that I regret that our state has not responded accordingly to his demands. He hasn't actually taken care of him. Awareness of climate change and the environment is very poor in most of our countries, also in Peru. But I congratulate him and the German Watch team we just met a couple days ago for this effort, because it sets a precedent. But I also want to tell Saul what we can do for him, what we will do for him. We can represent his demands in front of all the regional instances of local government, be it a municipality, regional government, or any ministry that has not attended his claims or his demands. That's what we are there for. We are representatives of the people. It is a pity that you didn't turn before to Congress people, but at least there are some of us who will listen now to you. And the other area where we can have an impact, I believe, is by increasing the participation of MPs at the COPs. We often wonder, why is there this gap between promises and action? All the negotiations, the NDCs, the commitments, the agreements don't become implemented so easily. And I think part of the problem is the lack of political control. MPs are there for political control. So we are the ones who should be sitting at the negotiation table. We have asked that from our Ministry of Environment, so that, for example, in the case of loss and damage, and in the case of this case, which is a flagship and should be a flagship case for Peru, we can actually set our conditions and try to impose some changes on the commitments and agreements that are made at the COP. So we are committed to help bring the case of Saul to the table at the negotiation meetings. And this is what I wanted to tell Saul, to encourage him and to say that we really thank him for being such a hero from our country to the world. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for those words of support. Are there, yes? Question, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I have a question for the science and the negotiation, a bit of both. So the problem with attribution studies is that legally they do not necessarily translate into causation in specific ways that you can tie to particular polluters or particular countries, sorry, particular companies. And the other problem with this, so we saw this in the case of Pakistan's flood. I'm from Pakistan, and there's a World Weather Attribution study that was just published. And it says that a good number of the deaths could have been avoided and a good number of the effects could have been avoided if you didn't have the infrastructures that you did across the river basin. And there's a whole bunch of infrastructures that are referred to it, right? So it's not just the fact that monsoons shifted or there was a rise in temperatures, it's also the role of real infrastructures. Now, many of those infrastructures were put in place by global banks, by the MDBs. And the present statement, as far as the draft is concerned, actually does turn to the banks and says debt forgiveness, forms of concession, non-concessional, in other words, non-debt creating finances. It doesn't say anything about MDBs and liability, of course, because that's only to the parties. Do you feel that there is a mechanism under what you all have been discussing conceptually for going against these banks, particularly the ones that have accepted and acknowledged liabilities under their own inspection and investigation and internal accountability mechanisms? In Pakistan's case, this has happened. For example, the World Bank says, yes, our project did cause certain damage in terms of floods. So do you feel that there's a mechanism to go in that direction? Do you feel that it can be made part of this kind of, the framework of the UNFCCC that we're talking about? And do you also feel that as far as attribution and causation studies go, that there's science that can go into an area that is more specific in terms of isolating particular polluters? And in terms of the polluters pay principles, please, if that can be brought in there in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Would anybody on the panel like to take that question? Go ahead.
Well,
I can start with the attribution question for more specific. So it's true, the work that's happening now are global models, right? And we're putting into global carbon models. Generally, the attribution science is hanging off of heat numbers, so it kind of depends on how different impacts are related to that. As far as we're considered for what we think will move through in most of the courts, and so I'd love to hear if you've got examples of where it's not moving through in your courts, is that the standard of evidence that we have at this point, in which you saw kind of being able to move through in the Germanwatch case, should meet the requirements of the law for that. As far as getting more specific, there are increases. So right now, a lot of attribution work is global. A lot of those numbers are global and the modeling is global. And we're working on kind of more isolated measures for what that looks like locally. There's really important questions that we have to ask ourselves and that science has to figure out for how we do that in an equitable way. So a lot of the current methodologies that exist require long baselines of data, and of course the areas that have that data are mostly in the global north. So there's real questions of how we can develop new statistical models and use new methods so that it can be a more equitable kind of growth of the field. But that is looking at localized. So, and again, with some of those questions, because different impacts are tied to those global systems in different ways. That's that chart that I showed, kind of why the science varies for different types of impacts. But we do expect kind of the first area to really be able to move forward with more of the truly localized work is with sea level rise. So again, that's limiting because it's only beneficial for communities that are impacted by sea level rise, but there's real efforts to be able to move that forward in a much more meaningful localized way.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond on this issue of World Bank admitting culpability? Is that a good platform for a legal case?
So yeah, thank you for that point. Just to kind of address this issue of, who's responsible for these damages, for these kinds of impacts. And of course, there are different levels of responsibility in the sense that we can say the major emitters have contributed to climate change, but of course, it's not going to be a major emitter that's going to go to Peru and fix the damage. The local authorities are responsible for that. So it's important to recognize that at each instance, whether it's major emitters, whether it's at a global political level or at a local level, everyone has their own responsibility they have to take, and really there has to be more of a cooperation in the sense that when we're talking about loss and damage, often those who are closest to the problem, who local governments facing in the areas facing the impacts, have very limited resources to deal with them, and so there needs to be more support, and that's exactly what should be mobilized at a UNFCCC level. But yeah, really there needs to be more cooperation in that sense.
'Hafiz, would you like to?
30 seconds. Colleagues, I'll be very brief. If I understood correctly, the colleague, you wanted to know the additionality. Actually, when we consider an incident like sudden onset events, cyclone, flood as climate induced, then we need to identify the additionality. But challenge is how to you prove that additionality. That's how the attribution science comes in. Developed country parties, there are so many funding entities outside the convention that can be useful, helpful to address the loss and damage. Maybe to some extent that can be useful to deal with the sudden onset events like cyclones or floods. That is the DRR regime that can be useful. But think about the slow onset processes like sea level rise. If you go Bangladesh, you can see our communities are already facing saline water intrusion and relevant associated impacts. So if you go particularly in our coastal zone, you will find communities who are really affected because our agriculture lands to some extent now cannot grow the crops. They converted their agriculture practices. They converted their land to the shrimp farm. As a result, they are losing their traditional livelihood. The laborers are losing their works. Colin is noting because he knows our coastal zone very well. So these are the additionality. And now we are asking a fund to address immediate needs of the vulnerable communities and ecosystems. Not averting, not the minimizing. That is the GCF is there. GCF is funding for mitigation 50%. GCF is there for 50% adaptation. Where is the money for loss and damage? Where will go adaptation fund, special climate change fund, JF? That's the project-based approach. You need to develop a project, then it's huge procedural mechanism you need to follow. Access those funds also are difficulties. That's why we are asking here to think about an innovative financial mechanisms that can meet the immediate needs of the vulnerable communities under a standalone funding entity of the Convention and Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hafiz. If there are no more questions, I don't see any hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask each member of the panel to make their final reflections on what they've heard, and then we will wrap up. So I'll start at the end. Cesar, would you like to just make your comments on what you've heard this evening? Thank you.
Just very briefly, I do think that there is a slow convergence of science, law, policy, and negotiations and activism at different speeds and at different scales that I would hope would be accelerated through the litigation. The convergence can happen more quickly. I agree with Del that the science is there, and also Noah mentioned the fact that in cases like RWE, already the science is being deployed, and learning from the trajectory of the body of litigation that I commented on in my presentation, what I see happening, what I think will happen is that the relationships of collaboration between scientists and litigators that have already been established in mitigation litigation will be redeployed, repurposed for the purposes of future loss and damage litigation. And again, and speaking to what Saul said, and also what was said about human rights and about negotiations, I after slow start, human rights activists, and I include myself, lawyers, include myself in that group, were slow to understand the importance and the urgency of climate change, that I think we have come to a point where the learnings from the past 10 years in litigation, in standard setting, with the approval of the recognition of the right to health environment by the UNGA, that all of those are pieces that are ready to be combined creatively, both in negotiations, but in the face of the limited progress on negotiations, progress will need to happen also on the litigation front.
Thank you, Saul. Sorry, thank you, Cesar. Saul, would you like to say a few words, maybe in response to what the member of the Congress said? Thank you.
Bueno, lo que podría decir que vivimos en la planeta es nuestra casa y tenemos la obligación de protegerlo y cuidarlo.
We live in this planet that is our house, and we must take care of this house. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Noah, your summary comments.
Yeah, thank you. So I think what's become very clear through this panel is that the science is getting clearer and clearer, the impacts are clear, and yet the negotiations are not coming along as quickly as they should on these matters. And so it's just a reminder that there are millions of people like Saul in the world, and if there's not a solution soon, they're probably going to look for a lot of courts to bring their cases. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Noah. Delta.
Yes, I'm excited by the increased amount of communication happening between law and science, and that does bring me hope for kind of what innovation can happen in cases and in this work, how science can better respond to needs that are being brought by these types of cases, particularly if we're moving into human rights and in legal cases in new ways. It's important to note that there are limitations in science, and it's important not to have that be the only thing that creates the barriers, or the boundaries around what we're talking about. So I'm really curious how science and the law can come together with community knowledge, some of the pieces around baseline data that I was talking about. How can we draw that from the existing data that exists within community? Cesar did an amazing event yesterday, and they were talking about this, and I think it's really important that science is sensitive to that as well, and that we're thinking about that again so that we can truly think about what equity looks like in this space as we use two really powerful and privileged institutions of science and law to address these very real problems. I'm excited to think more about how science and the law can answer questions around loss of cultural heritage, things that aren't quantifiable, and these realms aren't always good at thinking about. So there's a lot of questions, but there's also a lot of advancement and a lot of hope and a lot of creative thinkers that are in this space. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Delta. Lean, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, I will use the words of someone else, because I attended another side event here at COP27 where Luisa from the German climate case was speaking. And she said something that really struck me, and that very much relates to the negotiations here. She said that we are not litigating, we are not doing this because we want to, because we like to. We're doing this because this is the only option for us to actually find solutions and to make governments and corporations finally do the right thing to solve the climate crisis. And so, yeah, I think that's a very important message here in the UNFCCC, because this is one of the institutions that should be, or this is the institution and the process and the convention that should actually be leading to those solutions, and they're not there. And especially on loss and damage, nothing is moving, still not right now at the end of week 2 of this important COP, where loss and damage finance is the litmus test. So I think that's an important message to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Lean. And now, for the final words, Hafish, I pass to you.
Yeah. In my final words, I would like to recognize Christopher from German Watch, who was the mastermind of the Peruvian case. We all know the road as a lawyer. Of course, I do appreciate, but may I request, on behalf of me, Christopher, you would like to say something, final words, please. He didn't hear me?
Yeah.
Hafiz, thank you very much for giving me this short opportunity. I think we are at a crucial time for moving forward loss and damage. I think it was a historical step that we are now able to negotiate about financing for loss and damage, the first time after 15 years of blockage. And I hope that we will get a next big step in the next 48 hours agreed here. And, but we also can look at the same time and have to look how the litigation cases, and Saul is such a great actor who moves this forward. I want really to say a huge thank you to him. this is so much burden for him to do this, and it's fantastic. But we should also get more concrete how we connect this case with the loss and damage debate. And so my personal hope is that now we get some momentum in Peru to think about what can be done for loss and damage, but also for climate mitigation and for adaptation, to develop a real plan, and that then they ask for support from countries like Germany, but also others, to support them in this regard. And I hope that one part of the loss and damage plan will also cover the risk for Saul and the entire community in the region there. And it would be great if in 3 years from now that we are working in the implementation of this and not asking for it. So looking for how we really can connect the individual cases, to raise awareness in the countries, to get support from other countries and moving this thing forward and making it real. There are so many vulnerable people and they wait for the cooperation, and we have to do it quite soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and that's the end of this session. So thank you very much everybody for joining.